Insightful analyst Caitlin Johnston recently wrote, "The powerful understand that narrative control is everything. Power is the ability to control what happens, but ultimate power is the ability to control what people think about what happens. Human consciousness is dominated by mental narratives. So if you can control what narratives the humans believe about their reality, you can control the humans. The need to control the narrative is why the U.S. empire has invested so heavily in soft power and why it has the most sophisticated propaganda machine ever constructed. The empire invests extensively in narrative control, as do manipulative people in general. If you've ever had the misfortune of knowing a malignant narcissist or sociopath, you'll know they tend to pour immense amounts of energy into manipulating the social narrative about themselves and the people in their circle. Manipulators understand the power of narrative control. Ordinary people do not." End quote. Narratives are so important. False narratives are used to manipulate and control, and the narratives that we accept shape who we are. In ancient times, all cultures had their original myths, and in those ancient traditions, different gods and goddesses were associated with specific resources which they gave to men and women. In fact, the gods are depicted as wanting to give gifts to us, not holding back. It was a teaching of abundance, in contrast to the narrative of austerity that prevails today. In the myths of ancient Greece, Demeter was the goddess of grain and the increase of the soil. Ancient texts acknowledge this fact over and over and also demonstrate that Demeter was seen as giving abundantly and that it was wrong to deny her bountiful generosity. The ancient philosopher Plutarch, who was almost certainly an initiate into the ancient mysteries and who may have been a priest of the god Apollo, writes at one point, quote, "Why impiously offend law-giving Demeter, and bring shame upon Dionysus, lord of the cultivated vine, the gracious one, as if you did not receive enough from their hands." These lines show that the ancients not only acknowledge that the gifts of the field are given by Demeter and the gifts of the vine by Dionysus, but that the ancients understood that the gods give abundantly and that we receive enough from their hands. And that to act as if the gods did not give abundantly was impious and an offense to the gods themselves. All the resources had their origin in the realm of the gods and were given to the men and women of a nation by the gods. This includes all the natural resources which come from beneath the surface of the earth, which were understood to belong to the god of the underworld, who was referred to by the ancient Greeks as the wealthy one, Pluton or Pluto, in order to avoid saying his name. One of the ancient Orphic hymns acknowledges this perspective, addressing the god of the underworld in this manner: "O Pluton, holder of the keys to the whole earth." These resources from under the surface include all the gold and other precious metals and the gems and other precious stones, which is why the god holds the keys to the whole earth and was known as the wealthy one. Today we would add the natural resources of oil and natural gas, which have led to so many wars and schemes by men who want to seize the gifts that were given by Pluton to the men and women of other nations. The brother of the wealthy god of the underworld is the sky god Zeus, ruler of the thunderbolt. Thus, the electromagnetic spectrum can be understood to be a resource associated with the god Zeus of the thunderbolts. When these gifts given to the entire nation are privatized, meaning fenced off, private, deprived from other people, that's how oligarchs and billionaires become wealthy. All the riches of Google and Apple and Amazon require the use of the electromagnetic spectrum, which the ancients would have understood to be a gift from the god Zeus for the benefit of the entire nation, not for the benefit of oligarchs. In a similar manner, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, a small number of oligarchs became insanely rich through the privatization of the gifts that the god of the underworld had given to the people of Russia in the form of great reserves of oil and natural gas. So if they privatized those and took those gifts for themselves, they could become billionaires at the expense of the nation. But the most important resource given to any nation by the gods is actually those men and women who are allowed to be born into that nation, allowed by the gods to be born into that nation, and whose gifts are clearly understood in ancient myth as being given by the gods. Skill at weaving, for example, is described in myths of ancient Greece as being given by the goddess of wisdom herself, the goddess Athena, as are many other arts and skills. Athena is addressed in an Orphic hymn this way, quote, "O blessed mother of the arts, O gray-eyed and inventive queen." And there is, of course, the well-known story of Arachne, the mortal young woman who was given great skill at weaving by Athena, but then who, Arachne, foolishly challenged the goddess to a weaving contest, boasting that her own skill was greater than the skill of the very goddess who was the giver of that gift to Arachne in the first place. And other gifts are given to men and women by other gods and goddesses. Not only does the ancient wisdom of the myths teach us that all of our gifts are given by the gods, but they also teach that no child is even born unless the gods allow that child to be born into the land. The goddess Artemis was described as being present at the birth of any child and described as assisting the mother in her time of labor to give birth. An ancient hymn addressed to Artemis says of her, quote, "Dictina, helper at childbirth, you help women in labor. Orthia, goddess of swift birth, you are a nurturer of mortal youths." So all the natural resources were understood to have their origin in the realm of the gods, who give gifts to men and women for their benefit. But a central theme running through the ancient wisdom of the world is the importance of guarding against those who want to devour those gifts given by the gods for themselves at the expense of others. This danger is dramatized in the Odyssey, for instance, by the suitors who take over the home and the estate of Odysseus while he is away fighting in the Trojan War, and who terrorize his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. At the beginning of the Odyssey, the situation seems hopeless to both Penelope and Telemachus as the suitors lounge around, devouring the wealth of the household of Odysseus and threatening with violence anyone who wants to stop them. But the goddess Athena comes in disguise to Telemachus and tells him that the behavior of the suitors is outrageous and disgusting to the gods, and that Odysseus will eventually come home and use his wits and his skill to kill all the suitors, which he eventually does. This painting depicts Odysseus with his great bow slaying the suitors in his hall, aided by Telemachus, who is seen just behind Odysseus, slaying one of the suitors by driving a spear below the left collarbone of one of the suitors. So the behavior of the suitors in the Odyssey is a kind of parasitic behavior, devouring the wealth which belongs to someone else, and their behavior is condemned by Athena. They show by their words and their actions that they have no respect for the gods or for other men and women. In fact, besides devouring the flocks and herds of Odysseus in his own hall, they spend the rest of their time scheming about ways to murder his son Telemachus and sleep with his wife Penelope. So they're what we might call a particularly aggressive and violent category of parasites, parasites who devour resources belonging to another. But remember, we saw evidence that the most important of all the resources given by the gods to a nation are the men and women allowed to be born into that nation, and who each themselves are given various gifts. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus describes an encounter with a different aggressive, violent parasite who devours resources. That would be the Cyclops, who actually devours men from the crew of Odysseus's ship when he's on his voyage home from Troy. Odysseus warns the monster that the behavior of the Cyclops is out of line with the will of the gods. But the Cyclops replies, "You must be a fool, stranger, telling me to fear the gods or avoid their wrath. We Cyclops never blink at Zeus or Zeus's shield of storm and thunder or any other blessed god. We've got more force by far." This spirit of devouring the resources of others, and indeed devouring other men and women, either figuratively or literally, is also described in other ancient traditional wisdom, including the traditions of the indigenous First Nations of North America, who warn against a cannibalistic spirit known as Wendigo. This devouring spirit must be destroyed because the North American Indian traditions teach that those who spend too much time hanging around with a Wendigo can become a Wendigo themselves. The warning against such dangerous, violent, devouring parasites is found in the ancient traditions around the world. I'm going to use the Native American term Wendigo to describe this spirit. I use the word Wendigo to refer to aggressive, violent parasites who devour resources, including other men and women, and who despise the will of the gods. The Wendigo spirit is a spirit of taking without producing, which we see demonstrated in the case of the suitors, as well as in the case of the Cyclops in the Odyssey. And in the Native American tradition, it's the same pattern. The Wendigo feeds itself by devouring other men and women. I've made an entire separate video about the spirit of Wendigo, in which I demonstrate that ancient traditions from other cultures, including texts found in the Bible, describe parasitic behavior in terms of devouring other men and women and the resources given by the divine realm. So those three aspects of the definition are each very important. Wendigo, as I'm using the term, includes parasitic behavior of devouring the resources of others, and it's both aggressive and violent in nature. This behavior includes, metaphorically, or in the case of the Cyclops, literally, devouring other men and women. And finally, it includes a complete disregard for the will of the gods, as we saw in the Cyclops quotation. In fact, a disdain for the will of the gods. The Cyclops declares, "We never even blink at the thought of Zeus or any of the blessed gods. We've got more force by far." And the suitors act with the same disdain. But the fact is that neither the Cyclops nor the suitors are in reality more powerful than the gods. There's a way of the universe that cannot be resisted forever. And the wheels of heaven will continue their inexorable turning and will eventually crush those who are going against the way of heaven. Athena declares in the Odyssey how detestable to the gods is the behavior of the parasitic suitors. The ancient wisdom of all these different cultures spend a lot of time describing the dangers of Wendigo and advising ways of preventing Wendigo from devouring the men and women and the resources that the gods give to those nations. This emphasis in the myths is so important because parasites will try to manipulate the narrative in order to numb people to what's going on. And we see that with the suitors. Telemachus and Penelope, anytime they criticize the suitors or anyone else who criticizes them, they come back with a twisted narrative. And this is exactly what Wendigo continue to do. They immediately try and regain control of the narrative and say, no, you're being outrageous. We're just doing what's right. It's so important for the Wendigo to control the narrative because otherwise we would naturally want to stamp out this parasitic devouring behavior. We can see that the ancient myths make prevention of devouring other people's resources and other people central in the provisions for the forgiveness of debt which is often used as a lever to gain control over other people's resources. This is a picture from Hammurabi's code. This is in the Louvre, and it shows the king, Hammurabi, with the god Shamash. Underneath is a text which includes, in part, provisions for the forgiveness of debts, agricultural debts, in the event of a drought or other natural disasters that would make it impossible for the farmer to repay his debt. This provision of debt cancellation is there in order to prevent parasitical behavior, to prevent oligarchs from foreclosing on debt and seizing the agricultural land that belongs to others, seizing it for themselves and amassing bigger and bigger holdings and devouring the farmland of a nation. Debt cancellation in the ancient scriptures, including those in the Bible, was a powerful tool for preventing parasitical behavior from devouring your nation. And we see here that this is a tool that was given by the gods. The gods are against parasite takeovers. And following the ancient wisdom given to us from the gods prevents Wendigo from devouring the resources given from the divine realm for the benefit of the people. And that is the rightful role of the king or of the government, according to the ancient wisdom given to the different cultures. The prevention of violent, aggressive Wendigo parasites who, if not prevented, will devour the resources given by the gods, whom the Wendigo actually despise and refuse to honor. With the abandonment of the ancient wisdom, however, nations have been run for the benefit of Wendigo parasites instead of for the prevention of the takeover of those nations by Wendigo. Keep in mind that working definition of Wendigo as we look at some very well documented and undeniable examples that show that the nations in the West today are being run for the benefit of Wendigo rather than for the prevention of Wendigo, including very probably whatever nation you're in where you're watching this video right now. The first example we'll look at is the horrific case of Jeffrey Epstein, who was allowed to continue his predatory behavior for decades with almost complete impunity. Epstein graduated high school at the age of only 16 in 1969, bounced around to a couple of colleges, and then landed a job teaching math and science at a prestigious private school in Manhattan in 1974. He left in 1976, and he may have been kicked out because of his forward behavior towards female students, but then he was hired by Bear Stearns immediately, although he left in 1981 when Bear Stearns was being investigated by the SEC, the American Securities and Exchange Commission, for insider trading, and he was questioned but not charged. So then he set up his own firm in the late 80s, which may have been involved in money laundering, and that led him to a connection with a different firm called Towers Financial, run by someone named Stephen Hofferman, which was later found to be running a Ponzi scheme. It was shut down, and at that time, the SEC testified in court that Towers Financial was running, quote, one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, end quote. Epstein's partner, Hofferman, went to jail. Epstein himself was not charged and was allowed to go free. So we already see here an example of predatory parasitic behavior running a Ponzi scheme that the SEC knew about and busted, but with Epstein being allowed to go scot-free, we add to that fact the signs that his inappropriate attentions as an adult towards teenage high school girls, those warning signs, had already surfaced and been noticed as early as 1976 when he left that school. And as everyone knows, the story only gets worse from there. 3 years after being not charged in the Tower Financial Company Ponzi scheme, Epstein was reported to the New York police and to the FBI by a 26-year-old art student in New York, Maria Farmer, who told law enforcement representatives that both she herself and her 15-year-old sister had been sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein and his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell. Law enforcement didn't take any action against Epstein and Maxwell at that time. They were allowed to continue their predatory behavior. Presumably, this whole pattern of preying on young girls could have been stopped in 1996, if not earlier, but Epstein was allowed to continue to do whatever he wanted with complete impunity. And so during that time, he purchased this island in the Virgin Islands and a large property in New Mexico where he built a mansion. Virginia Roberts, who later testified against Epstein, and who says she was a sex slave from the age of 15 to Epstein and Maxwell, testified that in 1999 she was ordered by Epstein and Maxwell to have sex with New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson when he visited the ranch there in New Mexico. It was called the Zorro Ranch. So the predatory behavior was obviously continuing. In fact, it was escalating from 96, when he was reported to law enforcement by Maria Farmer that she and her 15-year-old sister had been sexually abused by Epstein and Maxwell. Almost a decade goes by after that, in which Epstein just amplifies his activities. And then in 2005, the stepmother of a 14-year-old girl in Palm Beach, Florida, reported that a rich man named Jeff had in his mansion sexually molested the 14-year-old. So the Palm Beach police began an investigation, finding more evidence of underage teenage victims during the investigation. Epstein was finally arrested as a result of the Palm Beach police activity in 2006, July of 2006. So fully 10 years earlier, one of his victims, who was also the sister of a 15-year-old victim, had reported Epstein's actions to the police and to the FBI, which could have prevented so many other girls from being molested, raped, sexually abused in the next 10 years, but nothing was done at that time. And Epstein had been allowed to just continue his predatory sexual abuse of teenage girls. So after they gathered all the evidence of victims leading to Epstein's arrest in Palm Beach, the Palm Beach police and the police chief was appalled to learn that the Florida State Attorney General, Barry Krischer, wanted to charge Epstein on only one count as a misdemeanor, aggravated assault regarding only one of the many victims whose stories the investigation had already uncovered, meaning Epstein would face no jail time. So the Palm Beach police chief called on the FBI for help in the case, but that only led to the federal attorney general for the district coming down and constructing a sweetheart plea deal for Epstein, which resulted in Epstein admitting to one count of soliciting a prostitute. They called 15-year-old girls prostitutes. That's wrong. They're victims. They're victims of sexual predators, but calling them a prostitute. And one count of procuring a minor for prostitution work. So that plea deal resulted in Epstein receiving a very light sentence and giving federal immunity for all of Epstein's co-conspirators. The victims in the case, their families weren't even told about this secret federal immunity deal that was worked out in this plea bargain. As part of this deal, which can only be called an absolute sweetheart deal for a serial sexual predator, Epstein had to report to a local low-security prison in Florida each evening and stay there overnight. He did have an initial period of a couple weeks or months where he had to stay in the prison, but after that, he could just report each evening, stay there overnight, after which he was free to check out in the morning and roam freely around during the day. So that arrangement ended 6 months early. Even that was lenient, but they ended it 6 months early after only 13 months. And so here's a sexual predator. He gets 18, 19 months. He gets out after 13 months. While he was in that sweetheart deal, he was supposed to be remaining in Palm Beach and checking in each night. But during the day, he would fly to New York City and even to Great St. James Island, that island that he purchased, which was also referred to as Epstein Island or Pedo Island in the Virgin Islands. And he was, again, complete immunity for violating these terms of this very sweetheart deal. So anyway, the so-called house arrest ended in August of 2010. And in September of 2010, Epstein's immediately welcomed back into high society, attending huge gala parties as early as September 2010 with celebrities. September, 1 month after this thing ends. Celebrities and politicians including Katie Couric, Woody Allen, Prince Andrew, Chelsea Handler, Ehud Barak, Leon Black, Wilbur Ross, Peggy Siegel, Lawrence Krauss, Peter Cohen of MIT, and Bill Richardson, New Mexico governor, among many others who could be mentioned. In other words, he was immediately supported and defended by powerful and wealthy people, including former prime ministers, sitting state governors, actors, socialites, after it's been perfectly clear Epstein is a sexual predator. So because of this rehabilitation, he's able to continue his predatory activities for another full decade almost before he's finally arrested again in July 2019 based on the allegations of Virginia Roberts Giuffre. She married and her last name was changed to Virginia Giuffre. Beginning in about 2011, she decided to start going public with her stories, which led to Epstein's final arrest in 2019 and then supposedly committing suicide in his cell. Now, much, much more could be said about the horrific Epstein episode, but it's quite obvious beyond any doubt that an actual monster was allowed to devour young girls for several decades, was just allowed to roam the street. Wendigo devouring was allowed because the government is run by Wendigo, and he was surrounded by other enablers because your society's been taken over by Wendigo. Instead of government preventing the devouring of the most vulnerable, government is enabling it. Why would he have been allowed to do that? Well, he was running a sex ring to compromise elected officials at very high levels so that you don't really have an elected government representing the will of the people in the United States. The Western governments have long ago been taken over by parasites, and in this particular case, the horrific case of Jeffrey Epstein, it's quite clear that the main reason this operation was allowed to go on so long is because his behavior was connected to the State of Israel, which is an important imperialist tool, Wendigo tool, used to seize resources in the Middle East, to control the Middle East and seize the enormous resources, mainly oil and natural gas, and those critical land routes and sea lanes that give access to the oil and natural gas of the Middle East. So this is part of a bigger picture of devouring the resources of other nations. But the Wendigo think nothing of devouring vulnerable people and allowing predatory devouring to go on for the purpose of devouring resources. It's almost unthinkable for most people to imagine that their government could be so corrupt as to allow a known predator like Jeffrey Epstein and his associates, there was a whole system in place, to operate freely for decades, preying on young girls and being openly defended by prominent members of society. It's disorienting. It's even terrifying to realize that your government is actually controlled by malevolent predators. But the Jeffrey Epstein case is only one example, and it's supported by so much evidence that you can't reach any other conclusion than that government allowed it. Another nauseating example is the evidence that shows that the United States government knowingly abandoned several hundred servicemen who had been captured as POWs by Vietnam and Laos, and whose return had been negotiated by Henry Kissinger in the Paris Peace Accords signed in January of 1973. Vietnam demanded reparations for the war, and the United States had agreed to pay $3.25 billion, which would be called post-war reconstruction. It was reparations, but when they made this agreement, they agreed, well, we'll call it post-war reconstruction in order to allow the U.S. to save face instead of calling them war reparations. The Vietnamese, by their own count, had 1,205 American prisoners of war at that time. We know the exact number that they thought they had because after the fall of the Soviet Union, a Western researcher found a document in the Soviet archives in which a senior Vietnamese general stated that exact number, 1,205 living American POWs, to the Hanoi Politburo a few months prior to the Paris negotiations. So the documented number, 1,205, given by a general, a Vietnamese general, to the Hanoi Politburo. But in order to ensure that the U.S. actually paid the $3.25 billion that had been promised, Vietnam initially only turned over 591 prisoners of war, which means that basically it released just under half the full number of American POWs, holding on to the other 614 as a way of ensuring the U.S. would pay the billions of dollars they had promised. The New York Times at the time even noted the surprise that American officials expressed at the low number of prisoners that Vietnam had turned over. Vietnam had done a similar move with the French following the defeat of French forces at Dien Bien Phu, but France had eventually paid to bring all their living POWs back. Despite the fact that the number of prisoners turned over was several hundred lower than what the U.S. knew to be the real number of POWs, they may not have had the exact same figure that the Vietnamese had, but they knew it was several hundred lower. Despite that fact, President Nixon announced to the nation on 29th of March, 1973, quote, "Tonight, the day we have all worked and prayed for has finally come. For the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All our American POWs are on their way home." We now have documents which have come to light which show that Nixon's aides had briefed him prior to this speech about the fact that we knew the number of prisoners returned was not the full number. So the president was knowingly lying to the American people when he said that all prisoners were on the way home. Instead, the United States government treacherously abandoned the 614, or whatever the exact number is, in the several hundreds, additional prisoners, and then denied their existence publicly and shamelessly to this day. That denial continues to this day. The U.S. received only 10 prisoners of war from Laos, or 10 prisoners, 9 military men and 1 civilian. But according to U.S. records, there should have been 317 military men held as POWs in Laos, not counting civilians. So in its final 1,200-page report on the POW MIA issue, published in 1993, the U.S. Senate Select Committee, we'll talk about that committee, on POW MIA affairs wrote in a footnote on page 91 that you can read, quote, "In a telephone conversation with Select Committee Vice Chairman Bob Smith on December 29, 1992, Dr. Kissinger said that he had informed President Nixon during the 60-day period after the peace agreement was signed that U.S. intelligence officials believed that the list of prisoners captured in Laos was incomplete. According to Dr. Kissinger, the president responded by directing that the exchange of prisoners on the list go forward, but added that a failure to account for the additional prisoners after Operation Homecoming would lead to a resumption of bombing. Dr. Kissinger said that the president was later unwilling to carry through on this threat," end quote. So that quotation shows that they knew. Former Arizona Senator John McCain was one of the 591 POWs released by Vietnam after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. The late Ross Perot, a Texas entrepreneur, former U.S. Navy officer, Naval Academy graduate of the Annapolis class of 1953, argues that McCain was a major player in covering up the fact of the abandoned POWs. During the 5+ years that McCain was held prisoner in Vietnam, his wife Carol was seriously injured in a car accident on Christmas Eve, 1969, in which her pelvis and both legs were smashed and her spleen ruptured. She had to remain in the hospital for a full 6 months during recovery and to undergo a total of 23 operations over the next several years. Due to the cost of the surgeries, her mother contacted Ross Perot, this is McCain's wife's mother, who was already active in the POW issue in Vietnam. He was seeking a release for POWs even while the war was going on. He became a very successful businessman after his Navy service by starting this company called Electronic Data Systems in 1962. He paid for Carol's medical treatment while her husband, John McCain, who was also a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1958, so a couple years after Perot. So Perot was a Naval Academy graduate. John McCain was a Naval Academy graduate. Ross Perot paid for Carol McCain's medical treatment while her husband, John McCain, was still a POW. Perot, who remained active in the POW issue for the rest of his life, accused John McCain on several occasions, in print, in writing, verbally, of covering up the fact that the United States abandoned hundreds of POWs in Vietnam and Laos. Perot told Newsweek, quote, "There's evidence, evidence, evidence." McCain was adamant about shutting down anything to do with recovering POWs. Ross Perot was so adamant that POWs had been left behind that he personally traveled to Vietnam at his own expense in 1987 to meet with senior Vietnamese officials about the POW MIA issue. He said they had productive business-like discussions, but that the U.S. State Department then sabotaged his efforts by making a statement about the Vietnamese government, a negative statement, saying that their government's in disarray, intentionally angering and insulting Vietnam in order to undermine the possibility of reopening official discussions on the issue. Ross Perot later stated that he had been told during this visit by a high-level Vietnamese officer that there had indeed been living American POWs left behind, and that some had been sent to Russia after they were abandoned by the U.S., and some had undergone torture and medical experimentation. And in a 1992 interview after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian leader Boris Yeltsin stated that this was true, that Americans had been shipped to Russia. So Ross Perot was doing everything he could to try and get this evidence out and get the media to talk about it, but just silence. There's like a blanket suppression of this whole issue. And John McCain, exact opposite. You would think John McCain, having been a POW and been one of those 591 who was released, would be for the return of the POWs. John McCain instead, he sponsored a bill in 1990, which went on to become law in 1991, purporting to help information on POWs and MIA servicemen come to light, but which in reality contains language enabling the information to be made secret and never shared with the American public. This bill, informally known as, quote, the McCain Bill, you can see from this official publication that it's called the McCain Bill, it contains this clause which says, if the Secretary of Defense determines that the disclosure of any record or other information may compromise the safety of any United States personnel who remain not accounted for but who may still be alive in captivity, then the Secretary may withhold that record or other information from disclosure, end quote. So while they're telling you there's nobody left alive, they're saying, well, any evidence that we find of anyone left alive, if it potentially could compromise anybody who's left alive, then we can smother that information, not release it to the public. We can withhold it from disclosure, end quote. This policy effectively gave the government a free pass to classify any information about missing POWs that it wanted to classify, to restrict. And McCain's bill basically just codifies into law this policy that the Defense Department was already following in terms of making information about POWs classified. In 1979, for example, a Vietnamese defector named Tran Vien Loc escaped Vietnam to America and told U.S. government officials that Vietnam still had living American captives in 1979. Tran Vien Loc helped defense agency police artists make police-style sketches of missing Americans, but the government immediately classified all this information and did not share it with the public or with the families of missing servicemen. Imagine that. You've got police artists drawing pictures and you don't even show them to the family based on this defector who saw them and knew about them. Horrifying. In 1991, Senator Bob Smith, himself a Vietnam veteran, began pushing for a Senate Select Committee to look into the POW MIA issue. Senator John Kerry, also a Vietnam veteran, actively opposed the idea. He's quoted as saying of the POW issue, quote, "It has got to be put to bed for the sake of those families, for the sake of this country, and in order to move on," end quote. So We know what he means by put it to bed. He means let's move on. Let's not look into it. Let's not talk about it. However, seeing the momentum on the issue and the push for a select committee, Kerry switched positions and suddenly began pushing for a POW Senate Select Committee. And since the Democrats had control of the Senate, Kerry was able to get himself appointed as the chairman of the Select Committee. So despite the fact that the committee final report included that footnote showing that Kissinger had informed Nixon in 1972 that the prisoner lists given by Vietnam and Laos were incomplete, a footnote which Kissinger and his lawyers tried to have removed from the report prior to publication, but at least it stayed in there. But the overall report struck a totally neutral tone, declaring in summary that, quote, there's no proof that U.S. POWs survived, but neither is there proof that all those who did not return had died. There is evidence that indicates the possibility of survival, at least for a small number, after Operation Homecoming. But that's it. It just gives you this bland, well, there's a possibility, no proof this way, no proof that way, just an open possibility. In 1993, a book was published by authors Mark Sauter, a former U.S. Army officer and Special Forces operator, and James Sanders, a former police investigator and forensic analyst. This 1993, their book was entitled The Men We Left Behind, Henry Kissinger, The Politics of Deceit, and the Tragic Fate of POWs After the Vietnam War. In that 1993 book, these authors, Mark Sauter and James Sanders, argue that taking this kind of position gives the government, quote, useful ambiguity, end quote. They write, here's another direct quote, by keeping open the possibility that some American POWs remain alive, the U.S. government bows to domestic political pressure for a full accounting and covers itself if a POW ever does come home. On the other hand, by denying there's any proof of the existence of American POWs, the White House can avoid a hostage crisis and the ensuing need to pay for and or rescue all the POWs. Neither the American public nor the Congress has ever been granted full access to the intelligence available at the Pentagon and White House. Therefore, no truly independent and informed panel or jury has been able to determine whether there is proof that Americans were kept in Indochina and whether any remain alive, end quote. They're not showing the evidence, so nobody can say that there's conclusive evidence. But there is, as Ross Perot said, there's evidence, evidence, evidence. This kind of cover-up goes beyond mere government incompetency or human error. Just like the handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case goes beyond simple explanations of government incompetency or human error. The abandonment of hundreds of servicemen at the end of the Vietnam War is such a treacherous and repulsive behavior that it's almost impossible to believe. And it's so inhuman that the use of the term Wendigo is justified. Notice that normal human beings simply do not act this way. There have been numerous military officers who bitterly opposed this position and who openly called for greater transparency on the POW issue, including former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and World War II combat veteran General Eugene Tai, who testified to the Senate committee that, quote, since 1975, DIA has received approximately 900 reports concerning alleged sightings of Americans, end quote. In 1986, he wrote a report which stated that, another quote, there is information which establishes the strong possibility of American prisoners of war being held in Laos and Vietnam, end quote. But his reports were censored and not released to the American public. A 60 Minutes news team, which was thinking of doing a story featuring General Tai, received a phone call from a colonel in the National Security Council slandering Tai and saying, quote, he's not too bright. That's the head of the DIA that they're talking about. They're saying he's not too bright. But someone from 60 Minutes said, yeah, I was called by this colonel from the National Security Council who suggested that he might be senile and called him not too bright. This is the head of the DIA is who they're calling that. Normal human beings simply do not act this way. And there are plenty of men in positions of authority who have tried to speak out against the abandonment of the POWs. In other words, men not possessed by the spirit of Wendigo, such as General Ty and Ross Perot, and another was Colonel Millard Peck, who resigned in protest from his position as chief of the DIA's Special Office for Prisoners of War and Missing in Action, stating in his resignation letter, this is a colonel who he volunteered for the Special Office of Prisoners of War and MIA because he wanted to get to see the evidence and get to the bottom of it. And after several months of that position, he resigned, saying, quote, "The entire charade does not appear to be an honest effort and may never have been. Practically all analysis is directed to finding fault with the source. Rarely has there been any effective, active follow-through on any of the sightings, nor is there a responsive action arm to routinely and aggressively pursue leads. I feel strongly that this issue is being manipulated and controlled at a higher level, not with the goal of resolving it, but more to obfuscate the question of live prisoners and give the illusion of progress through hyperactivity." End quote. In other words, finding fault with the source in order to blame anyone who brings evidence. They're going to get attacked. They're going to get called a nut, a crank. Finding fault with the source. Any family members who ask for action, they get attacked instead of the horrific cover-up being attacked. The late Congressman Bill Hendon of North Carolina wrote a 640-page book in 2007 entitled An Enormous Crime, based on his 25 years of research into the subject of the abandoned POWs. A congressman, U.S. congressman from North Carolina. Here's a picture of the cover of the book, which contains a U.S. spy satellite image from 1988 showing the letters USA stamped out into a rice paddy in Vietnam. Somebody walked around in the rice paddy to make these letters, along with a set of distinctive secret symbols that military airmen and aviators were trained to use if they were shot down in enemy territory. Just imagine this prisoner, photograph from 1988. So by 1988, he would have already been in captivity for around 20 years. So he's making this effort, a great danger to himself, to tramp out these symbols and the letters USA, significant risk, in hopes that they'd be discovered. But eventually, he realizes no one's coming for him. Imagine what he would think if he knew that a U.S. satellite had taken this clear picture of his effort, but that in spite of that image being seen by his own countrymen, politicians like Henry Kissinger, John McCain, John Kerry were working hard to cover up the evidence because the decision had already been made to abandon all those POWs after the war. Others who testified that they believed living American POWs were left behind in Vietnam included James Schlesinger and Melvin Laird, each of whom had previously served as Secretary of Defense during the period of the Vietnam War. Here's a report from September 22nd, 1992, describing their testimony that they had been shocked by Nixon's 1973 statement that all American prisoners were on their way home. And here's another headline from that very same day. So they testified in September 1992 to that Senate committee headed up by John Kerry with John McCain on it. They testified that they'd been shocked about the statement that all the POWs were on their way home because they knew that was false. But on that same day, here's another headline that came out in which former Secretary of State Kissinger called their testimony, quote, lies. That article says that Kissinger, quote, vehemently rejected allegations that the United States may have knowingly left some U.S. prisoners of war alive in Laos or Vietnam in 1973 when U.S. forces withdrew, end quote. But as we've already seen, there's a record that shows Kissinger himself warned Nixon that the prisoner lists from Laos were incomplete all the way back in 1973. So decide for yourself who's the liar in this situation. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Sidney Schomburg published extensive analysis about the POW question and the cover-up role played by Henry Kissinger, John McCain, and John Kerry aided, he pointed out, Sidney Schamberg, they were aided in their effort to cover it up by a press which refused to touch the story, no matter how explosive the evidence and no matter how important for the American people to know the truth. In 1992, Schamberg published an article entitled, quote, "On MIAs, the press was lazy or cowed," end quote. That's the title of his article from 1992. In 2010, Sidney Schamberg published John McCain and the POW Cover-Up, an extensive article worth reading in its entirety for the evidence it presents. And in 2004, he published an article entitled, quote, "John Kerry Covered Up Evidence of POWs Left Behind in Vietnam." In that 2004 article, Schamberg wrote, quote, "What was the body of evidence that prisoners were held back? A short list would include more than 1,600 first-hand sightings of live U.S. prisoners, nearly 14,000 second-hand reports, numerous intercepted communist radio messages from within Vietnam and Laos about American prisoners being moved by their captors from one site to another, a series of satellite photos that continued into the 1990s showing clear prisoner rescue signals carved into the ground in Laos and Vietnam, all labeled inconclusive by the Pentagon, multiple reports about unacknowledged prisoners from North Vietnamese informants working for U.S. intelligence agencies, all ignored or declared unreliable, persistent complaints by senior U.S. intelligence officials, some of them made publicly, that live prisoner evidence was being suppressed, and clear proof that the Pentagon and others of the keepers of the secret destroyed a variety of files to keep the POW MIA families and the public from finding out and possibly setting off a major public outcry," end quote. Ross Perot, who'd been involved in the issue of POWs in Vietnam since at least 1969, was on record saying that he believed the reason for the abandonment of those servicemen after the war and for the cover-up of the overwhelming evidence was that the CIA had been overseeing the opium and heroin production in Laos throughout the war, and that some of those American POWs, especially those abandoned in Laos, would have known about it. And so that's why the criminals involved in that operation didn't want any POWs coming back or any of the evidence released to the public to cover up their criminal behavior of running opium and heroin from the Golden Triangle. Let's look at that. The evidence that the CIA was indeed sponsoring opium growing and heroin production in Laos during the Vietnam War is beyond question. One of the foremost authorities on this subject is Professor Al McCoy, who's been studying this subject for decades, stretching back to the time of Vietnam itself, the Vietnam War itself. He's the author of a book entitled The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, first published in 1972. Professor McCoy explains that Western imperialism has cynically used opium trafficking since the late 1700s in order to help them gain control over the vast resources of the nations of China, India, and elsewhere in the world. However, prior to World War II, the vast majority of opium was grown in India. And it was only after World War II that the region of northern Burma, northern Thailand, and northern Laos became a leading production region for opium and heroin. Explaining this in a speech given in 1992, Professor McCoy says, quote, "The sudden growth of the Golden Triangle's opium production is a post-war phenomenon. After the collapse of the nationalist Chinese government in 1949, some of its forces fled across the border into Burma. I like to think on the map of the collapse of China disgorging the nationalist forces in two directions, southeast into Taiwan, where they remain, and southwest across the border of Yunnan into northern Burma. The abandonment of the POWs is horrific in and of itself, but the connection to running opium and heroin for the purpose of gaining control over the resources of other nations and making money deliberately dealing heroin to our own soldiers in Vietnam and later expanding the market for heroin addiction to the United States, that reveals the spirit of Wendigo at work, like a parasite devouring lives in order to enrich itself, sucking up the resources of the nations for its own gain. Later, the same criminal pattern would play out with the importation of cocaine from South America and Central America in order to gain control over the governments and the rich natural resources of those regions. The human cost in poverty and in lives destroyed has been absolutely enormous. And the same story has continued with the production of synthetic opioids in more recent decades. This is not normal, healthy human behavior. The ancient wisdom across cultures and across oceans shows us that this kind of behavior is against the order of the universe. It's unhealthy. It's against the gods, and the gods hate it. And in the Native American legend of the spirit of Wendigo, it's the same. So it's around the world. The Wendigo will spin narratives to try and say that the Wendigo behavior is normal or even praiseworthy, as we see the suitors doing in the Odyssey. But that's a false narrative. Lies, even if the Wendigo themselves believe their own false narratives, those are lies that they spin to try and justify their behavior. The loss of the ancient wisdom given to every culture, which warns us so strongly against this Wendigo spirit, has led directly to societies that are controlled and governed by those who enable and empower Wendigo behavior, devouring the lives and resources of others, instead of being led by those who understand that their role is to stop parasites and prevent Wendigo from devouring the people and the resources given to the nation by the gods. This is not a natural situation. The suggestion that governments are always parasitic and Wendigo-like, that's just another false narrative that the Wendigo throw up like a smokescreen to give cover for their predatory behavior. The Wendigo have to hide behind lies, just like we see with the abandonment of the POWs. That required a tremendous amount of effort to control the narrative and prevent the people from seeing what's going on. Why do they have to hide behind lies? Because the people have to be kept from understanding that their own government not only does not care about the lives of its citizens, but deliberately sacrifices and devours them in order to gain control over natural resources for the enrichment of a very few criminally connected families, instead of for the benefit of those to whom the gods gave those gifts. The gifts of the gods are given to the nations. Wendigo want to devour that. And we can see from these two examples, these are not debatable. The evidence in the Epstein and the POWs is overwhelming. And it shows just the depth of the depravity that we're facing. And when we see that depth of the depravity that we're facing, it's almost overwhelming. Most people would prefer to buy into a narrative that blames incompetence or imperfect information or stupidity, rather than accept the truth that POWs were deliberately abandoned and the abundant evidence of those POWs' ongoing existence was deliberately suppressed with lies and bluster and the willing complicity of a corrupt press, core, media that refused to pick up the story. And most people would rather believe it was just incompetence, that a predatory network of child rapists was not, was just allowed to continue to operate, was not prosecuted for decades, and that it was connected to the highest reaches of power in the United States and Great Britain and the state of Israel. But the evidence is undeniable that we're not talking about simple incompetence. We're living in a Wendigo-controlled society, a Cyclops-run society, a suitors-run society. And when we face the raw truth of that fact, it cuts through all the false narratives that are spun to try and cover it up or obscure it from our understanding. And then we ask, what are we supposed to do about it? How are we supposed to live our lives in the face of this knowledge? And I'm convinced that in order to move forward in the right direction, we have to understand the point that I've been trying to highlight throughout this video, The fact that the ancient wisdom around the world, given to all the different cultures as part of their original instructions, warns against the spirit of Wendigo and gives us the methods and the tools to identify and prevent it from taking over. And that means we need to look back to the ancient wisdom that was given to us and that was deliberately hijacked by this same Wendigo spirit during a period that led directly to the end of the ancient world and to the rise of a new kind of supremacist behavior that had not been seen before. And I'm talking about the rise of literalist Christianity and literalist Judaism, scriptural supremacists and their intolerance towards the ancient gods and the ancient wisdom and the ancient teachings that prevent the rise of Wendigo parasites. These scriptural supremacists took the position that they're right and everyone else is wrong, and that they're more special to God than others, or their God is better than all the other gods, or if you don't listen to their Jesus, then you're going to hell. All the other gods are false. This was a new form of supremacism that is totally different from the ancient wisdom of the cultures and nations of the earth. In fact, it's condemned by the ancient wisdom. It's the very same kind of attitude that we see displayed by the suitors and the Cyclops in the Odyssey, and obviously the Odyssey condemns that. And it's an attitude that is flatly and plainly condemned by the gods themselves. So we can think of the rise of literalist Christianity and Judaism around this time as a takeover by the Cyclops and the suitors. You can argue over which one is which. It doesn't matter. Both represent the imposition of a Wendigo narrative over the top of stories that in and of themselves dramatize the very opposite of what these scriptural supremacists teach. The stories that were collected up into what are today called the Bible, the Old Testament text, the New Testament text, can be shown beyond any doubt to be myths of the same sort that are used to convey the ancient wisdom in other cultures, Greece, or ancient India, ancient China, ancient Japan, the Americas, Scandinavia, the Pacific Islands. They're all related. The myths in the Bible are not the problem. The hijacking of those myths by Wendigo supremacists who teach that they can devour the resources given by the gods for their own enrichment, that's the problem. That supremacist hijacking by the Wendigo led to the collapse of the ancient civilizations of the West and a plunge into the Dark Ages, impoverishment of society to enrich the few supremacist Wendigo parasites who bled the people dry and took all the resources for themselves, while spinning narratives that said it was entirely proper for them to take all the resources for themselves. It's the will of, God, and it's good, just as the suitors would have claimed. Understanding this points to the solution: a rejection of Wendigo narratives and a return to the understanding given to us in the ancient wisdom that formed the original instructions for all the different cultures and nations around the globe. That ancient wisdom shows us how to connect with nature and with ourselves, how to live in harmony with the gods, how to find and recognize our life's partner, how to act with virtue and morality in all matters, and how to find meaning and purpose in industry and expertise and excellence, and indeed in playfulness in this life. I call this return to the ancient wisdom modern ancient man, because I believe that is the best response to the situation we're facing. Recovery of the ancient ways that the Wendigo hijacking and betrayal of the ancient world has tried to keep from us. This doesn't mean buying into a bunch of BS, New Age narratives, which themselves are almost certainly spun out there for us by the Wendigo as part of their smokescreen. It doesn't imply rejecting modern industry and living in primitive conditions of some sort. In fact, one of the main criticisms of the Cyclops in the Odyssey itself is that they don't do anything with the gifts given to them by the gods. They don't practice any industry. They don't build any ships or make anything beautiful. That's not the path of modern ancient man. Modern ancient man is about finding purpose and abundance by turning away from the poisonous Wendigo narratives and returning to the original patterns given to us in the ancient wisdom, which are for our benefit and blessing, and which are just as appropriate and important to us today as they have ever been. The gods have gifts to give men and women, and the gods want to give us those gifts. And so I'll be talking more and more about this and creating video courses about the gods and goddesses themselves and what they offer us every day for our lives, as well as about subjects related to this overall return to the ancient wisdom and rejection of the false narratives and lies of the Wendigo. It's very much like cutting out all the bad poisons that have been allowed to be put into much of the food that's sold to the people. Returning to good food is part of it, in fact. But just as important as the food that we put into our bodies are the narratives that we put into our minds. And the ancient wisdom was given to us so that we can build our lives following the right pattern, not the false narratives spun out by the enemies of the ancient wisdom. I'm so excited to have you on this journey with me. Thank you.